It's time again for the Insiders with Chuck Chvala and Scott Jensen, sponsored by the Wisconsin Counties Association and the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership.
Hi, I'm Scott Jensen, former Assembly Speaker.
And I'm Chuck Chvala, former Senate Majority Leader.
And we're the Insiders. Chuck, in the last month here, the state of Wisconsin lost two legends of the state Senate. You had a chance to serve with them, Tim Cullen and George Petak. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Tim Cullen and what a loss it is to the state?
It is a loss. Tim was regarded as an amazing majority leader. He was the majority leader when I came into the Senate, and he put me on the Joint Finance Committee. I've told people everything in 4 months that I hadn't learned in 2 years in the Assembly. It was wonderful. But here's the thing about Cullen. He's written a couple of books. Tim told me, and I've used this story for years. He said, Chuck, you have to remember with your colleagues, anything but a yes is a no. He said, they want to say yes to you. They'll talk about all sorts of things, but if they don't say yes, that means they're not with you. They're not supporting you. I found out that was absolutely true. And in fact, the corollary to that is in politics with politicians and especially with legislators is even a yes may be a no. In a leadership election, my view was you always needed to have at least one extra vote beyond what you needed, because even if they told you they were voting for you, they may have told 3 people they were voting for. And I won a leadership race after that to become the minority leader. And that actually takes us to the time of George Petak. But before we talk about Petak, perhaps you'd like to talk about Tim Cullen.
Well, you know what? I was impressed with Tim Cullen when he was the leader in that he had a caucus filled with ambitious politicians, people who were going to do big things. Russ Feingold, John Norquist, a young Chuck Chvala who went on to run for governor. There was a lot of people to manage in that caucus, and he was able to keep them on track. And they were really the chamber you could count on was going to get it done and get it done on time during his time in leadership. The other thing that's to me is, we often say there was a stunning event in politics. I do remember people in the building actually being stunned after the election of 1986, when people were saying, well, this Tommy Thompson guy is probably a one-termer. Who's all going to run against him? Probably Tim Cullen's getting ready right now to set himself up for the next 4 years to run. And instead of running against Tommy Thompson, he joins his administration. The governor, Republican governor, gives one of the biggest jobs, in fact, it was the biggest job in the administration, to a guy who was a potential rival against him in the next gubernatorial election. Department of Health and Social Services, as we called it at the time, I think. And Tim went on to actually make that his career path after that, going on to work for Blue Cross Blue Shield and Anthem in the years after that. So that was a rare moment where I think people in the building were just plain stunned by the answer.
And Scott, actually, to build on what you're saying, I think that showed the political savvy of both Tommy Thompson and
Yes.
Tim Cullen. They both knew this was the right place for both of them to be, and it did work out very well for both of them. By the way, I want to point out, Tim Cullen attributes the anything but a yes is a no. In his book, he attributes that to Bill Bablich, believe it or not, who was another giant out there in the state Senate. And these guys really knew what they were doing. Let's talk about George Petak for a minute. George Petak, in my view, was a very nice man. He switched his vote, which allowed him to be recalled on the Brewers Stadium. Now, at the time, I knew, and later on I talked with George about the fact that that was political malpractice, not by George Petak, but by the Republican political leadership, who had several people, including their very leader, who could have voted for that, taken George off the table, and they would not have lost the majority. I was the minority leader at that time. There was a recall election, and George Petak lost his seat. And that was really, in my view, a sad thing. Years later, I had lunch with George Petak with a couple of other people. George, what a nice man. He was not bitter about this at all. Fortunately, he had done, of course, Tommy Thompson was in, and he got a job in the administration, got a pay raise and all. But he didn't talk about that. But he was not bitter at all about what had happened. And a lot of people would say George Petak saved the Brewers. I would always tell people this was great. We got the majority, and Milwaukee got the Brewers to stay for a number of years, and it worked out very well. But Very nice man. And I always thought that George Petak was one of those people that you would enjoy serving with in the legislature, whether you were in his political venue or not.
Well, definitely a very good man. There are a lot of people who hold their Christian faith, but few held it tighter than George Petak. I'm told by friends talking with him in his final days, he was actually looking forward to the afterlife. He believed enough that he knew the best chapter was yet to come. That tells you a lot about the kind of guy he was. I think people, everyone's been focused on the stadium vote and talking about George Petak, but he got in the legislature with another big upset in Wisconsin politics. He defeated the sitting Senate majority leader. A guy on the local school board builds this huge coalition in the grassroots over the issue of parental consent for minors having abortion, which is really the catalyzing issue for that huge crowd of volunteers he had. And then he sort of startles everybody by tipping over and defeating the sitting majority leader of the state Senate, a very rare thing in Wisconsin politics to happen. You said he's a good man. I think that's because in the end, he always tried to do the right thing. And he didn't want to vote for the stadium, but he didn't want to lose the Brewers. He'd promised his citizens that he wouldn't vote for the stadium and include Racine County in it. And yet he thought it is more important that the state, that I put the good of the state and the public in Wisconsin than my political career. And he ended his political career by essentially keeping the Brewers in Wisconsin. So you don't see many people who have that kind of courage and understanding of priorities. Most politicians be trying to figure out, okay, how do I play this angle? He was like, how do I make sure I do the right thing? I went to opening day at Miller Park with lots of members of the legislature. We were all wearing this hat. Here's mine right here. And on the back, it says, God bless George Petak. And the president of the United States was there, and he threw out the first pitch, right? And the place erupts. And then later they introduce George Petak, and the place was nuts. It was a bigger ovation than the president of the United States' ovation. Everyone there knew they were in that building because of that man standing right over there. It was a wonderful tribute to a guy who did the right thing when it was needed.
And unfortunately, he did not have to lose his seat over this. If his leadership had done this correctly, they could have kept the majority. George could have kept his seat. They would have had Miller Stadium. Surprisingly, but on the other hand, I think Scott makes a good point. He felt that the bigger issue was, do we need the stadium or not? And if they're not going to come through for the stadium, I will. And he did.
See you
See you
soon.
next time.
You've been listening to The Insiders with Chuck Chvala and Scott Jensen, sponsored by the Wisconsin Counties Association and the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership.